Hey folks, I'm Guy Kestevan, the Tester Man, and this is my workshop walk round on the new Trek Generation 7 Fuel EX8. So, as you can see, from the welds around that tall head tube, this is the aluminium frame model. There are 3 aluminium frame models and then there's a bunch of carbon models above that. Trek claim weight of 4.6 kilos for this alloy frame and then 3.3 for the carbon frames. But the good news is that you get the same full feature list on both carbon and alloy. So you've got new clamped cable routing, none of it going near the headset. You've got replaceable bolt-on tailgate. You've got improved internal storage. With 2 new bags, sort of ripstop nylon rather than the previous neoprene sleeves. And actually now, even on this aluminium model, that feels like it's a proper bonus on the bike. There's more volume in the down tube, so there's a bigger hatch there, so it's easier to get them in and out. Before it was pretty much a token gesture, but now it's actually a proper practical storage setup on there. As you can see, this is Alpha Platinum alloy, that's what Trek call it. And also, rather than the split top tube and curved seat tube, which you had on the Generation 6 fuels, you've now got, I mean, it's a little curve at the nose, but now this slightly curved rectangular top tube runs all the way to a little saddle gusset there, but it's a straight seat tube. I mean, it's tapered and it squares off at the bottom, so you've got a really chunky base there for the main pivot, and also there's a little pontoon there and another sort of block there welded on, which serves as the mounting points for this 2 bridging pieces at the bottom. So there's still a fair bit going on, but Trek say this not only makes the frame lighter, it makes it stiffer. It gives you more room in the shock because the shock isn't kind of leaning forward like it was before, so you can run pretty much any shock, even coilovers in there. You've got more room for a bottle in the main frame, you've got more room for an accessory mount there, and you've got more standover on all sizes, plus you've got shorter seat tubes as well across all sizes, which means that even the medium models, I mean this is a large, but even the medium models get a 200mm stroke dropper post now. Very similar rocker layout to, I mean, I think Trek debuted that on the fuel, or the top fuel in 2000 at the Olympics, this rocker linkage. I mean, it's a classic in terms of the shock driving. It's the classic sort of Turner layout from the early 90s. But as we move back, we'll see Trek are still using their ABP, active braking pivot, which puts the rear pivots concentric, so pinned straight through the middle by the rear axle there, and that stops the brake torque from that side loading up the seat stays as much as if it had an FSR pivot or even a seat stay pivot. Just keeps everything a little less dynamically disturbed when you haul on those big DB8 brakes. And because you've got these massive seat stays on there now, you can see it's completely bridgeless up there, which gives you plenty of tyre room. I mean, these are 2.5s in here, but there's room to go bigger, I reckon. And then down on the chainstays, you've got a chunky bridge down there, but you've got a rubber flap stopping anything falling into the gap there and getting chewed up like a rock crusher between mainframe and swing arm. You've got more armour here, and you've got big ribbed chainstay guard there, because if you put it in the 10 cog, this much bigger chainstay with the higher routing for a stiffer back end will actually, you know, the chain will actually drag slightly on that. You're not going to notice it in terms of pedaling, but without that chain guard protector on you, the paint is not going to last long. It's UDH, and on this fuel EX8 model, you now get SRAM's base level T-type flat top transmission, Eagle 70. So all the same sort of very carefully ramped and profiled cassette design on the back there for that super solid shifting under power. And if you've already watched the live ride review, you'll have seen me carrying on talking while absolutely max torquing up some seriously steep climbs, and the shifting still being absolutely nailed on that. If I was talking about transmission already, I was going to talk about it later, but never mind. You've got a steel chainring there. It's a 30 tooth, and then you've got, I mean, they're not the most fancy crank arms in the world, but it's SRAM dub, and on this model they're 170mm, and that's a 30 tooth chain set on there as well. So, I mean, it's not the lightest system, weighs in just under 2,300 grams, and you can't, I mean, Eagle 90 is very, very rebuildable, and Eagle 70 is semi-rebuildable in that there aren't as many spare parts available for it aftermarket, and it's not quite as sort of modular in the way it's put together, but still very stiff, very tough, very accurate rear mech that's designed to take a lot of abuse before it gets damaged. And that's pretty much the same as the whole frame, because while this bike comes, the EX comes with 145mm rear travel, courtesy of this Flotex shock, which comes in a 205 by 60mm stroke. The LX versions of the bike use a 65mm stroke, and that gives you up to 160mm travel on the rear. And in the MX version, which uses this shock, but with a 27.5-inch rear wheel, that has 150mm of travel. And then up front, that's matched by forks of different travel. So on this on this EX, you've got Fox 36 rhythm with 150mm travel. On the MX bikes, that goes up to 160mm. And then on the LX bikes, you've got a full 170mm, 38mm, Fox 38 fork in there. So, I mean, but that's on the Fox spec bikes. You get Fox and RockShox spec bikes in the same way as you get SRAM and Shimano spec bikes. Sorry, this is all over the place. I've just let my mouth running away with me a bit here. But basically, I mean, you could do the rear wheel switch before, but it didn't have that extra long travel option. That's all. Previously, you've always had to go to like the next model up. That normally, certainly previously it was with the Slash, but now the Slash is that high pivot bike. So this fuel now kind of fulfills all the longer travel duties within the Trek range, which is why you're looking at a much stouter frame, certainly in the back end, and from what Trek have said, the front end is also significantly stronger as well. And certainly on the trail, it feels absolutely rock steady, particularly through the rear end. But as a lot of people have noted in comments, at nearly 17 kilos for this complete bike, that does mean, and it's a lot of weight to pedal around. I think it's the heaviest non-e-bike I've ever tested. Well, not including tandems as well. But, I guess, I mean, what I'm going to do, actually, before I go on, what I'm going to do is I kind of have decided I'm going to do a full stripped down video anyway, just so we can look at all the individual components and see how much of that weight is the fork, how much is the wheels, how much is... I mean, it shouldn't be things like the bar and stem. It's a race-faced turbine bar, Bontrager Elite stem. I mean, DB8s, they're not as heavy as Mavens. I think they're about 360 grams each side. Rhythm forks aren't light, but, I think they're about 2,300 grams, but again, not vastly heavy. It's not 2,800 like a base level RockShox 35 or something like. Piggyback shock adds a bit. I mean, 200mm dropper in a 34.9. I reckon that's a weighty piece. Because obviously, you've not only got the extension there, you've got the extension deep into the frame as well. And because Trek used this oversized 34.9 to make it all good and stiff and sturdy, even that long extension, that's going to have some effect. But yeah, what I'm going to do is I will actually properly strip this frame down so we can see exactly where those grams are hiding. Right, I'm going to stick the casing back on the internal storage. I mean, even internal storage, it's not much of a big deal putting it into a carbon frame because you can sort of locally increase the strength using the carbon layup, but cutting a big hole in an aluminium down tube, that's quite a big ask structurally in terms of making it happen without reducing strength, and that involves a lot of extra hydroforming and inevitably some extra material around it, and even things like the armour and stuff on there. Though I have taken them off, and they weigh just over 80 grams for the pair, so that's not what pushing up towards e-bike weight. But you know, you've got little details like ISCG tabs on there, and I guess it just all adds up. But anyway, like I say, I'll do a full weight strip down on the bike. So let's talk about the Geo now. So default Geo is 64.5 on the head tube for this large, 485mm reach, 76.9 degrees seat tube, 338 BB height, which is a 35mm drop. And then on this large, you've got a 447mm rear end, and that equates to a 1298mm wheelbase. So this is a long old bike, but with 420mm seat tube. Like I say, you've got room for a long old dropper. And it also means that if you want a longer bike, but you're relatively short-legged, you can trade up in size. And while Trek have actually dropped the medium-large frame option, which used to be a real Goldilocks fit for a lot of people, including myself, because you've got that slightly altered overall dimensions. With that shorter seat tube, that means you can kind of move between sizes that bit easier, so it kind of blocks the Venn diagram, and means that everyone should be able to find a decent fit. And I talked about it at the start, but that is a tall old head tube on there. It's 140mm. So while it's got a decent stack of spaces on there and some rise on the bar, it means you can, if you want a lot of stack on your bike, to keep you more upright, keep you over the back of the bike, then you don't have to resort to a really big sort of Maasai Warrior style neck brace and a ton of Dakota Norton style rise on your bars. You know, it's been positioned naturally, kind of works like a good coach and moves you more back on the bike, more upright, and centers you in the middle of this geometry. And also the fit is proportional, so as well as obviously changes in reach and stuff like that, the back ends change from 337mm through to 452mm, and then seat angles also vary from between, I think it's 78.6 degrees down to 76.2. So the larger size is getting the slacker seat tube and the longer back end to kind of keep all the proportions in order so they don't wander around too much on the climbs. And then on the two smaller sizes, small and extra small, you get a 27.5-inch rear wheel as standard. And that's kind of the big change is Trek. I mean, it's always been a bike that could take a longer fork and could take a mullet rear wheel, but they've really kind of made it official in the same way as they did with travel changes on the Fuel EX. They've now made it, you know, into 3 specific versions. However, while it used to be just a case of flipping a chip on the linkage, you now have to use a different linkage for the MX and the LX bikes, and they also offer different shock bridges as well for that longer travel shock. And the idea with that is that apart from head tube angles, which change from 64.5, like I say, to 64.2 and then 63.5 on the LX, the rest of the geometry is preserved throughout the rest of the geometry is preserved throughout the bike, whatever you do with the travel and the rear wheel. And I have to say, my normal default setting on that is, well, I don't really, that seems like a lot of fuss to me, because if I want a mullet back end, I tend to want it more slammed. Don't really care about a steep seat angle, because if I'm on a mullet bike, I'm probably not prioritising climbing. But this bike is so well balanced in terms of handling. I kind of appreciate that Trek have done that. And at the end of the day, you don't have to fit the new parts. You could just stick a 27.5-inch back wheel in there and have it lower and a bit slacker in the seat tube if you wanted. So, but there is an official upgrade route there, and also there's a progression chip on the bottom. So that's 20% as standard in terms of progression, then 25% if you move it to the rear shock there. But I have to say, with the shock set up as it is, I mean, there's a slightly more generous than normal bottom-out bumper in that shock, just to bring the stroke up short. But I have to say, progression is really, really good. And you can play around with the internal volume spaces anyway to tune how that shock feels at the end of its stroke. And you've got rebound, and you've got a firming up lever on the far side for your pedalling. But I have to say, it's interesting because it's quite a mobile system. If you look down, the shock is moving a lot, as you'll see in the live ride video, but it makes very, very little difference in terms of the chain feel. So it never feels soggy or baggy or overly bouncy. Even when you're out the saddle and the shock is, it's going up and down like the proverbial rabbit back there, but it still feels like a very efficient pedaling bike. So I've never felt the need to reach down and flick that lockout lever on, even on fairly prolonged climbs, despite the fact it's heavy. And those Brevard tyres, Brevard Pro, is it? Yeah, I mean, they're basically a rebadge of the TR5 SE5 tread that Bontrager used before. Reasonable all-rounder. If I'm honest, I've not spent. I've only spent 2 or 3 rides on these tyres so far. So, and I've got to the edge of sliding them, but I haven't put them on a different bike to fully change them. So expect a tyre review coming up. But first impressions are that they're okay, but not particularly outstanding in any way. And, same with Trek wheels. They seem solid enough. Again, haven't weighed them, but you get a really fast reacting free hub in there. So good engagement on those, and they're 30mm internal. And they're interesting. They actually come tubeless from the shop, but they don't have the sealant in there. So get the shop to add the sealant, but make sure they shake the bottle up. Because I was left with a load of residue in the bottom of mine, which is obviously stuff that should be inside the tyre, sealing it up, rather than sat in the bottle, doing no good at all. What else do I need to talk about? So, like I say, long post, typical sort of modern, fairly short, broad saddle. Grips are interesting choice, because it looks more of a sort of, almost a sort of towny ergo choice rather than the high traction choice. I mean, on the plus side, they're a relatively tacky compound, but not the fact. I can see people change it to a more aggressive grip, especially this is a bike that does ride really, really aggressively. It's quite. I mean, well, obviously that's up to you, and you can ride it mellow. It's very high traction. It's very smooth. You can cruise around on it perfectly happily, but certainly I found the harder I pushed it, the more obvious it became just how well balanced, how capable, and how up for taming some properly rowdy technical terrain. It really was. I'm far off reaching the limits of this bike, even in 150, 145 so far. Not helped by the fact I actually shot the live ride review without knee pads, so I didn't slam it into the rockiest terrain I've got locally. But from the stiffness of the frame to just how well that back end performs, even with that base Fox Float X performance shock in there, the suspension is absolutely outstanding. That's the real call out. Although there's some great practical detailing on here, it's that suspension performance that's a real call out on this bike. And even that's Fox 36 rhythm up front, always a really good dependable fork. And again, just felt really, really impressive on this bike. But again, it's the fact that it sits you so well centered, and you're dynamically really well positioned on the bike, that means even when that fork starts to struggle, because the damping is relatively simple, that the whole bike still hangs together really, really well. And to be honest, even the weight, yes, it's a downside on the climbs and when you're trying to accelerate it, but just having that kind of lightweight e-bike style weight means that it just sits on the ground with real authority, and that's backed up by the stiffness of that big rear end as well. So there we go. That's my tech talk round on this new fuel. Apologies if you're a new viewer to this channel. I mean, welcome, but you probably found that presentation a bit random. I do tend to get sidetracked. These aren't scripted. It's me just shooting from the hip on the ride field and the details and stuff. I mean, obviously, I've got all the geometry. I measure that myself, and I weigh all the bikes myself as well. So they're verified. They're not just manufacturer numbers. But sorry for jumping around if you're not used to that. And if you want an idea of how this bike rides on the trail live, then the main sort of backbone of my channel is my live ride reviews, and I'll put that clip at the end for you to jump on. But obviously that's where you need to go to see how this bike really performs on the trail. But in a word, it's absolutely outstanding. The dynamic balance is great. The suspension is absolutely brilliant, certainly with basic dampers both ends on it. It's really impressive. And SRAM Eagle 70 is impressive. It's nice to have that dropper post length, the bars, the stem. I'm a big fan of the DB8 brakes. And I know not all testers are, but I think for their weight and for their price point, I think the modularity is really good. I think the power is really good, and the fact they run on mineral oil is a bonus as well. The only thing I'd really say is potentially you might want a stickier tyre up front, but I'll have a better idea when I've done a proper independent test on those. And also there's just a ton of great practicality. The internal storage is worth having now. There's loads of armour on here to keep your bike protected, to keep it quiet. And that's one thing I would say, it is a very quiet bike. It's not just the fact the cables are damped, just because the suspension is working so well. And again, dynamically, it's really quiet. It's not a bike that you feel you need to move all around on. You can sit in it really comfortably, even in this stock Geo. And because they've used this ZS headset now, you can actually just fit whatever adjustable headset you want. They used to run a system where they provided their own eccentric cups, but now it's just up to you if you want to put an angle set in there or not. And that obviously, it's just part of Trek moving towards simplifying their bike range, is that this one frame, or two frames, this one frame does from like 145 to 160, and then you've got the top fuel which does sort of 120mm XC right up to 130mm sort of dad country light trail. And the benefit of that is it not only makes the range simpler and gives you options to upgrade this bike. Yes, you have to buy extra bits potentially, although I can't remember, did I say you can just pull the travel reducer spacer out of this shock? That will give you increased travel at the rear, but to get the kind of full package with the right leverage and stuff, you should really change the linkages as well. But you can get halfway there in the same way as you can just change the rear wheel if you want. But if you want the full Trek sort of official experience, you do need to change those parts on there, which is, less convenient and obviously more expensive than just being able to flip a chip and stuff like that. But the big thing I haven't said all the way through this is this bike is far cheaper, despite the fact it is an all-new frame. It's not just a slightly modified version of the previous frame. It's an all-new structure, as you can see, particularly in this area, and an internal storage. This came in at £3,200 in the UK yesterday, and the old Gen 6 bike was still selling at £3,900. And that was actually a reduction from £4,350, which is what it originally sold at. So you are getting a better riding bike with better practical features for, 700 quid, even at the reduced price, and up to, 1150 quid compared to the original price, which is great. I mean, it's great to see Trek doing that. And it's also good to see, bikes moving towards slightly more realistic pricing. The only thing I think a lot of people have talked about in the comments, like I say, is the weight. But is that just a factor of what we're demanding from a trail bike now? A lot of people have been kind of referencing the weight of this compared to earlier generation Trek Fuel VXs they've got. But those weren't bikes that were slated to take a 170mm fork. They didn't have a really long thick dropper post in them. They didn't have SRAM 70 transmission on them. All of these little things, they all add weight. The increased strength, the fact that nearly all of us are riding harder off bigger, features. Even cross-country riders, and light trail riders like myself, we're all hitting things harder than we ever used to, and not expecting to have any issues as a result of that. We're not nursing bikes around anymore going, well, what can you expect? We're expecting essentially downhill style survivability in a trail bike now. So is that kind of weight an inevitable result of what we're asking for? It's not that different to the Specialized Stump Jumper alloy, which comes with an inline shock and TRP brakes and Shimano transmission, all of which are lighter than one you've got here. And that could easily account for the 300 gram difference. And then, things like the Merida 14700, which is 800 grams lighter. That's Shimano again, and I think that's an inline shock as well. You might correct me if I'm wrong in the comments on that. But there are reasons why this Trek is heavier. But like I say, what I'm going to do is I think it'll be an interesting exercise to actually do a whole video on why and how are modern trail bikes getting so heavy. And is that something we just go, well, there's so many positives, I'll just have to wait a bit longer to get to the top of the hill? Or is it something that really, really threatens the survival of this whole sort of longer travel exercise by, human-powered trail bike? Because you are getting up to the point where lightweight e-bikes will overlap with pedal-powered bikes now, which just seems crazy. But obviously, completely different price brackets that one as well. And also referring to the price, even the top models of this bike with like Fox Factory or RockShox Ultimate, and then like XT or SRAM XO, and carbon wheels, carbon bars, carbon rail saddles, all of that kind of thing, are still only just over £7,000. So in terms of a more, I'm not going to say affordable, £7,000 mountain bike is still pretty ridiculous, but at least it's not in the teens, as we're seeing from a lot of boutique or prestige brands now on a day-to-day basis. It's almost like, well, it's just what mountain bikes cost now. But I like the fact that Trek are obviously working really, really hard to bring those price points down. And as far as I can tell from the ride and also the construction and workmanship here, and from my experience with just things like how tough the paint is and how tough the frame has been on my Top Fuel long-termer, they're definitely not skimping on quality with the Trek bikes either. So that's a really, really positive thing. So kind of witted on at the end there. Hope you haven't gone to sleep. If you've enjoyed this, then click the notifications, give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Only 40% of you have subscribed. And as I'm just closing in on 40,000 subscribers, it would be great if a few more of you could subscribe and get me over that 40k mark, because I won't bombard you with spam as a result of that. It just keeps you in touch with what's happening on the channel, because I've got a ton of testing up going forward. And then if you really want to support the channel, then please consider giving me a YouTube thanks donation, or indeed pledging through Patreon, which means you get early, exclusive and behind-the-scenes edits as a thank you. But for now, I've been Guy Kesteven, taking a typically unscripted, slightly random, round-the-houses talk through on the new Trek Fuel EX Generation 7 multi-character, multi-travel all-rounder, which I think is a brilliant bike in many, many ways. But if you want to see me seeing that live at speed in a really, really excited manner, then make sure you watch the live ride review. There's a link down there below. Cheers, folks.